please, Regina, introduce your colleagues, where they're from, and let's the session start.
Okay, like all of you, I'm going to begin by saying that my thoughts and concerns are with the Ukrainian people. The first social crisis of Putin's senseless, unthinkable, brutal war is the Ukrainians, are the Ukrainians. The second is going to be perpetrated in Russia on Russian citizens. In my view, there's plenty of time to allocate blame for all of us. But for now, the most important thing is to understand what is happening and to think deeply about the events. I'm so grateful today that we have 3, 4 very important colleagues who can give voice to what is happening in the everyday lives of Russians today and tell us a little bit about what is happening. Margarita Zavadskaya, who's here with her son, is a research fellow at the Department of Political Science in European University, St. Petersburg, and at the Alexandria Institute in University of Helsinki. She's an accomplished scholar of public opinion in Russia, and she writes terrifically for the independent outlet Riddle, which you can find online and which I recommend highly to all of you. Andrei Yushkov is a graduate student at the O'Neill School. He writes on subnational tax policy, public debt, and fiscal federalism. Prior to joining our PhD program, he studied at St. Petersburg University and at the University of Bonn in Germany. Andrei Semyonov joins us from Perm. Andrei is a fellow at the Senior Research Associate at the Center of Comparative History and Political Studies, an associate professor at Perm State. He writes broadly on local protest in Russia and on political opposition. And you can find his short writing on what's been happening over the past year at Ponar's Eurasia, which I highly recommend as a source of narrative from our Russian and Ukrainian colleagues. Finally, I'm really pleased that Jeremy Morris will join us. Jeremy is a professor of Russian culture at Aarhus University. He is an interdisciplinary observer of the everyday in Russia, working on a very astounding book, I think, and is doing close ethnography of what's happening in Russia. I highly recommend that you follow Jeremy on Twitter because he's giving us very up-to-date information, and also that you follow his blog Post-Socialism, which is excellent. Okay, our format today is not talks but questions. I have 4 questions I'd like to ask people. If you want to piggyback on my questions, just 2 fingers and we'll call on you. If you all want to piggyback on other respondents' comments, just signal me and I'll get you involved in the discussion as well. So let's start with Rita. With the release of new polls yesterday showing broad support for President Putin and the war, I wonder, after 2 decades of disinformation and a great deal of fear circulating in the population, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the meaning of these polls and how you compare what's happening now to the work you did on the rally around the flag effect in after Crimea.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today. These are very dark times for Russian political science and social science. And it's extremely hard actually to make sense and to keep actually cold head in this situation. But today I'm talking from Helsinki, so I'm not going, I don't really know what's going to happen to my teaching responsibilities back in St. Petersburg. This is something that has been postponed. So, and of course, all our projects that relates to studying public opinion actually are also on hold. But anyway, so I would like to talk, maybe to bring to the table to today's discussion 3 points. The first point is I will draw upon the studies I've done together with Yelena Sirotkina, who is in Chapel Hill now, United States, working on public opinion as well. It's about rally around the flag effect, which is very well known and has primarily been studied on American data. So, and basically most of the research that exists so far actually comes from the American polls. But there is relatively little research done on what's going on in authoritarian conditions, especially during the military operations. So the research I've done together with Yelena were mostly about the post-Crimean euphoria that kind of invaded Russia and Russian public opinion, and Vladimir Putin's ratings actually, yes, you agree with me. Yeah, they stayed at the hit extremely high numbers, so around 80+ % of public approval. But after the pension reform, the ratings has gone down. So as all of you mentioned, so and these effects is very tangible, and that this negative impact of the pension reform has remained extremely strong even until the beginning of the war, or the military operation, how Russian government calls it. So that's the rallying effect was very large, and it's the way people, Russian respondents, attributed the blame for foreign sanctions and the way they rewarded the president during this rallying effect was very extraordinary, even compared to the American studies and other studies as well, is that the Russian State Duma and the government, they failed to benefit from the rallying effect. Only the president actually capitalized on that. So this is the main finding actually we have. And actually, instead of punishing the president for negative economic effects and sanctions, most of the respondents, they rewarded the president because they attributed blame to the West and that Russia was defending. And this also a result of the Russian large-scale propaganda. But my second point is about propaganda and Russian media. So how we actually should, should not, but how we can actually potentially, one of the ways to look at them, to interpret them. This is the first point. So this rallying effect has been extraordinarily long, and it actually came to its end only after a couple of years. So, and if we compare to other studies, so this is pretty unusual. But on the other hand, authoritarian ratings tend to be very sticky. I mean, to the extent we can trust them, of course. Going back to the new realities we are all these days, and the notoriously known Xion polls. So what we should really trust here, if we are to trust anything, is not the numbers, or we should not trust, is not the numbers. I think the main, the key point, the key problem or issue here is the wording, how these questions are articulated. And this is the first thing that needs to be remembered. And if you look at the wording, especially those of you who read Russian, so they do not sound as properly articulated survey questions. They sound as referenda kind of questions. So do you approve are you approve of the decision by the president? So it doesn't sound like a normal or usual public opinion question. So if you pay attention, so to the results, is that there are no questions about popularity per se. So these are the questions about decisions and particular steps. And of course, there is no term war. This word is forbidden, as you know, today. And anyone, even ordinary people, posting online that there is war going on in Ukraine. So this term is actually equal to the fake information and is subject to severe penalties and criminal charges back in Russia. So for either extremist actions, for instance, I think Andrei and I, so we are potentially in danger because all sane people did that. And of course, there is also a treason. So because this is again the wartime. This is why I don't think we need to interpret the Xion results as a overwhelming support for the war. That's not the case because there is research and there is methodological debates about whether it's ethical and whether it makes sense to, to conduct any service during the wartime. And finally, we also know that public opinion sometimes it can swing very quickly, even if it's true, just let's believe it for a second. So it's very likely that if we ask the same question even next day or even earlier, so this public opinion will change. It's highly conditional on the circumstances. The last point I would like to make is about why, if any, actually would approve of this military operation. So this may stem from the Russian media, of course, and to the extent we can trust the studies is that these are people who primarily watch television. So those who consume the news from the social media, they do not support the military operation. Then there are very dramatic generational gaps in the way people support the current action. But again, so this is the wartime, and it means that people's approval can change like in an hour. So depending on what's going on. And finally, it's not necessarily even the propaganda. We know that the overall trust based on our research, our own research, is extremely low, especially to the television. Most Russian respondents, they usually tend to underestimate and underreport the extent to which they consume Russian television because it's perceived as something shameful. So я не смотрю телевизор. So this is something which is very typical for Russian respondents. But on the other hand, given these circumstances, so it's extremely hard to perceive so that's what we know from media studies and political psychology. It's called cognitive dissonance, as many of you know. It's extremely hard to identify oneself with something which is terrifying. So this is why most people, they are at the stage when they're just not prepared to believe that what's going on is actually is a war and their own country is an aggressor. And this information is so hard on them that they actually would prefer an alternative picture because it's a kind of a coping mechanism. So that's what I know from private conversations because we do not have representative data on that. But this is my main impression, that this kind of dissonance, that people are not ready to accept this new world. And those actually, we know that Facebook actually has started this huge campaign on distributing information, the true information, what's going on in Ukraine. Actually, if we rely on media studies, so it's called hostile media environment. If someone who really supports the Russian state, and for instance, Vladimir Putin, encounters the information that Russia is doing atrocities in other countries, they would not actually just change their opinion overnight. They would just get stuck and shocked, like shell-shocked. So, and another reaction that people may defend their position because it's their identity, at least it's very core of what they tend to believe. But again, it's really hard to tell. So what are the percentages these days? So who are these people? So we do have some vague-ish, I can elaborate on that during the Q&A, or if you want to know more about that, I can share my speculations or some data. But of course, I mean, all the data we used, I have is heavily outdated given the circumstances. But I think that's all I wanted to say. So thank you so much for giving me the floor, and thank you for your support.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to jump in right on this question? I think we're going to come back to these themes. Yeah. Okay, my second question for Andrei Yushkov. Even in total information blackouts, pocketbook economic conditions carry a lot of information for citizens. So I wonder if you could talk about how Russians are already experiencing sanctions and world events and what's likely to unfold in everyday lives going forward.
And Dave, because we don't have the camera sit here.
Okay.
We will record you and the microphone is like much more, and people will see you.
Thank you. Oi, here's Andrei.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much, Regina, and everybody. It's very hard, of course, to speak to me as a Russian citizen. I mean, we all have the same feelings here in this room. And well, yesterday I basically canceled all my lectures because I had to help my friends back in Russia, in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, to just leave the country. So many young people in Russia, they're just leaving right now. And I mean, this is another effect that we will also soon experience. And we'll talk about But in terms of general pocketbook effects and the effects on the Russian people through the Russian economy, through the Russian budgets, well, of course, the situation is evolving very rapidly and dynamically, and it's very hard to predict right now the full scale of these effects. But I think that, well, I will just try to summarize some general equilibrium effects and several channels of these effects. So first of all, I mean, people are already experiencing troubles, economic troubles back in Russia, because first of all, because of the exchange rate. And especially people who are trying to leave the country and people who just go to buy groceries, and this effect will persist. So the exchange rate is basically 50% up already, and who knows what will happen next. So the effect will be through foreign trade, of course, because some imports will just be banned and some imports will become prohibitively costly for Russian citizens. So this is one channel. Another channel, I mean, we all know that the Russian economy is sort of heavily dependent on the Russian government. And it's, in a sense, it's controlled at least partly by the Russian government. So there are two effects, potential effects. One is directly through budgets, and another one is through government-owned enterprises. So the effect through the budgets, well, again, we know that the Russian federal budget depends a lot on oil and gas. And actually, in last year and in 2020, more than 40% of total revenues came from oil and gas. And it came through the mineral tax and also through custom duties. So these are two primary things that will be affected if, I mean, if Western countries stop buying Russian oil, which is currently very difficult, of course, and gas. But this is on the table, at least. And I mean, if this happens, if the revenues from oil and gas decline significantly, and also other revenues as well in the federal budget, then there will be like general equilibrium effects for regional budgets that will also experience a significant downfall this year because they depend on profit taxes, and profit taxes will go down immediately. The budget of the pension fund, as you know, there are about 42 million pensioners in Russia, retirees, and it was the pension fund was long in the deficit, and the federal government basically in 2020 it had to provide 6 trillion rubles to this budget, to the budget of the pension fund, which is now like $60 billion. And of course, we know that if the federal budget experiences a huge deficit, then they will not have enough money to support the pension fund. And well, here now we are in this debate again about the battle between the refrigerator and the TV set, right? So, and I mean, 42 million pensioners, retirees, they will experience those effects, well, almost immediately, but of course later this year, and they all depend on medical supplies, and of course, these are also imported goods. So I mean, the effects will be just everywhere. And also, I mean, some regions are dependent on federal transfers. And if federal revenues decline significantly, then regions will experience a very, very difficult time. And some regions also depend on borrowing. So they are indebted currently, and interest rates, they just skyrocketed. And we know that commercial loans for the citizens and for the regions will be much more expensive. And I mean, there will be effects everywhere. So this is my point. And well, I think we can save some questions for the later discussion. But yeah, my point is that the Russian economy and the Russian citizens will experience dramatic consequences of the sanctions and of course of this terrible war.
Thank you, Andrei. Jeremy, do you want to add what could happen as Western companies pull out of Russia? Have you thought about that much?
Yeah. I mean, I think I can add a little bit to what Andrei said. And actually, I would love to to have to ask him a question, which is about the ability to counter inflation for the Russian state, and the ability to replace imported medicines, which he mentioned. At what point does inflation start to get out of control? But before I ask him to answer that, yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I wasn't expecting was the comprehensiveness of sanctions and how they will shut down large parts of the service economy, which of course is a source of jobs, and they will shut down the most vibrant parts of the manufacturing and industrial economy, right? So what we often forget is that a lot of good blue collar jobs were brought to Russia by multinational companies, right? So when we hear that that Far Eastern companies are joining Western companies in no longer continuing production, that means there's going to be a lot of people losing their jobs in, for example, a factory that makes computer monitors that is owned by Samsung. Yeah, that company will effectively be mothballed, right? I mean, my focus is on the auto industry, right? And even we're hearing today, the Russian auto industry itself will be partly shuttered because it is dependent on a partnership with the main French automaker, right? So we're seeing a ripple effect, not only in relation to the massive currency devaluation shock, not only in relation to oil and gas, which is still not clear, as was already said. I mean, that would be potentially the next step, right? So not only that, we should also look at how there's going to be an enormous depression, not a recession, a depression in the Russian economy, just from the effect of the shock effect of the end of multinationals within Russia, but also the supply of Russian companies of the necessary goods to keep going from outside, right? And so what's also important is that Japan and South Korea, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Japan at least has said that it will stop supplying semiconductors, right? And so people say, well, what about China? That is the big question. But China buys its semiconductors still from Japan and South Korea. So that will be the question. Will the group of companies, will the group of countries that are imposing sanctions be prepared to put pressure on China not to circumvent those sanctions, re-export of things like semiconductors? Without semiconductors, there is no car industry, right? And maybe
So I just want to add that Taiwan also has blockaded semiconductors, and they're also a big supplier. South Korea's come out about shipbuilding, but not semiconductors yet. We'll see. Do you want to say a few words about inflation?
Yeah, so I agree totally with Jeremy, and I think that, well, again, there is a risk of hyperinflation even, but inflation will be necessarily high because of this currency devaluation and everything that is happening. In terms of the substitution, I think it will not benefit the Russian people, of course, because, well, we know that the quality of Chinese medicines, for instance, is worse than, of course, European and American medicines that will be most likely prohibited or very costly. So yeah, I think that, well, we are currently exploring this effect, but yeah, there is a significant risk of inflation population, and it will also have a huge impact on other factors that I mentioned.
Thank you. We have a two-finger. Would you like to introduce yourself? And you'll have to be loud.
I really don't want to introduce myself, but my name is Monica Kondraka Jensen. My background and love is Ukraine. I put together a course here at Indiana University on an introduction to the culture of Ukraine. But I come here today as a retired person who has a driving interest in what's going on in the world right now. My question is probably something that no one can answer, but I'm sitting here thinking, with all of these deficits that are beginning to take place for the Russian people, is there some point when they're going to start asking questions and saying perhaps our media is not leading us in the right direction, or I wonder, will they just continue to demonize the West? I just wonder if there might be a tipping point somewhere.
So you've just jumped to my last question. So, but that's fine. If you don't mind, we're going to skip over to go and then have that big discussion, because that's clearly where everyone's thinking. Let me just go first to Andre. So Andre, you have been studying social mobilization in Russia for a long time now. You've studied the opposition. Lots of people are saying no mobilization is possible because opposition is decapitated. And yet we've seen 7,500 people arrested. We see numerous silent protests. We see a tremendous amount of signatures on petitions. Medusa has a list of these on its website. Can you talk a little bit about what you see from Perm and where you think these, how you assess them and what you think it might be happening?
Yes, thank you, Regina. Well, that's a trying times, of course, and it's important, I guess, to talk about that. Well, let me start just from putting this whole thing, the mobilization and the collective action that are happening now in Russia in a context. I think what is important to note, it looks like there was a whole path towards the decision which was made by the president on 21st of February that included, of course, all the precautionary measures against the opposition and the collective action, so that the consequences of this decision he could weather lightly. What I'm talking about is that we know that before the so-called special military operation, or simply put, the war, the Kremlin made enormous efforts to sort of control over the media environment we did talked about. They also banned the Navalny Network, the most formidable organization that supported the collective action before 2021. And also there were cooptation of numerous civil society organizations as well that could be a part of this sort of larger movement, not to mention the intimidation campaign against the activists and those who support them. So in short, I think what was important is that the Protestant infrastructure, which was growing after the for fair elections movement and got some muscle and reinforcement after the presidential campaign of Alexei Navalny in 2017-2018, it collapsed in the previous year. That allowed Putin to have this sort of leeway and the freedom to move, because he knew that there was no the opposition at home is not in a it was decapitated and the capacity was quite low. What we see now, I think, because of these sort of things, we know that organizational backbones were already destroyed. That's why we see the professional networks rather than trade unions or any sort of other formal organization to protest or to support the anti-war campaign. And also in terms of the participation in anti-war rallies, yes, 76 more than 7,600 now are detained, according to OBD4. So the numbers are growing. It looks like it kind of resilient turnout to the streets, so people are protected, mostly in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We have to also take this into account. But I think, well, if we compare these numbers, the turnout numbers to the campaign, to January, February campaign in 2021, in defense of Alexei Navalny return back Russia, the turnout is quite low. Here in Perm, usually like 30 to 40 hundreds gather, even for the unauthorized rallies back again in January 2021. I've been to 2 rallies, and I saw like the first was on Thursday, last Thursday, on the day of the intervention, and there was just 200 people on the streets. And I think the crucial variable here is the fear that is spread over in these networks, not necessarily among all Russians, but certainly among the activists and those supporting anti-war campaigns. The fear is almost physical. So we can see that in the conversations, in the on the media, on social media, etc. And this is the most important factor that now shapes the I think at least the active part of society that protests and participates in the public campaign. As for the rest of Russians, I think this is a good question, whether there is a tipping point to sort of to join the collective action. My current feeling is that, of course, you cannot change media consumption overnight, and also with the things like shutting down Echo of Moscow and the Dost TV Rain and some other, and intimidating again the spread of alternative news on social media. So the rest of the population for a while will be cut off the alternative frames and alternative explanations of what's happening. I'm pretty sure that the pocketbook, of course, sort of evaluation should make some way into the preferences, into the evaluations of the situation. But how long will it take, given that there is a huge package by the relief package by the government? Still, they control the media, and there are many other things that are like, again, the usual anti-Western resentment among Russians that would just keep the base level of participation low. Given all this, I think it might be a tipping point dynamics, but so far I wouldn't bet on that very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. I just want to point out that professional associations did kick off big protests in Hong Kong. It wasn't the same, but they really led the way. And so maybe these will make some inroads. Jeremy, this is exactly where I wanted to go with you. You're doing this deep ethnography, talking to people about their attitudes. And I wondered if you could kick off this discussion about where it goes and what's happening now and how things change, how attitudes might change.
Well, I just wanted to start by saying Andrei is completely right. There is such an atmosphere of both fear and demobilization among the potentially more active people that, one of the points I wanted to make is that the people that have come out are incredibly brave, and I really, really, really reject the narrative that is being put around that why aren't the Russians rejecting this? I mean, just going outside with a piece of paper will get you a criminal conviction. You will lose your job, or if you're a student, you will be thrown out of university, right? So when people say, oh, it's only 7,000 people, right? You cannot compare that to anything in a democratic state. I'm actually encouraged, even by the very small numbers that Andrei described. And unlike, our other speakers, I can speak freely. I am not under any threat, and we should just reflect for a minute about how everything that Russian passport holders do and say has potentially severe repercussions for their future. What I wanted to come back to was two things: pocketbook, but also rally around the flag that Rita started to talk about. So let's start with pocketbook, right? I think we are very early. I think we haven't started to see the effects of the massive loss in purchasing power, right? And so that will be really important to watch. I have a kind of optimism actually that even unlike after the global financial crisis, after the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, right? I think Russia has changed for the better. And I think potentially the pocketbook question is the most important question of all. In that, even for the greater cause, I think many Russian people will stop and say to themselves, why have I been immiserated because of this this action by my government, right? Because going back to what I said before, even if they can carry on selling oil and gas, and I don't know the details, but I think they can, right? Because I just don't see so far Western Europe switching suddenly into rejecting that kind of that trade, right? Even if they so the point being that life is going to change for everybody in Russia, and it's going to get a lot worse, but especially for the lower middle segment, right? Who we often think of as potentially the most amenable to kind of the status quo, to being more, what historians call morally indifferent to autocracy, right? Morally indifferent is the word historians use to describe why Germans accepted the final solution, right? Moral indifference. So if we think that the lower middle classes have been the most morally indifferent so far, they are also potentially the most at risk through economic downward social mobility. So it goes back to what the other Andrei talked about earlier, right? To what degree can budgets compensate for that? What inflation, what is the meaning of inflation, right? Things like that. So that's the pocketbook. And then rally around the flag. I am not expressing an opinion about sanctions. I am not expressing an opinion about the effectiveness of sanctions on Russia's foreign policy. What I can say is that massive sanctions and even more to come, because clearly we've just seen the latest news is that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, says that Putin has told him that he will only accept full annexation and occupation of the whole of Ukraine. This is the latest news, right? So we can expect much more escalation from the US and from the EU. So if that's going to happen, and we assume it is, then one of the effects of sanctions is not going to be necessarily a rally around the flag effect. And I completely agreed with everything that Margarita said, right? We shouldn't trust survey data, or rather, survey data is incredibly problematic to interpret, right? So I completely agree with her there. We should expect a form of dealing with cognitive dissonance, right? that she also mentioned that can be easily manipulated into, okay, we are actually annexing Ukraine, but we now have to be defensive because the West has declared war effectively on Russia, and the only response to that is, again, I wouldn't call it a rally around the flag. I would call it a kind of defensive consolidation among Russian people. Right? We are together alone. Maybe what the leadership did was foolish. Maybe what the leadership is doing is morally wrong, but those things don't necessarily matter anymore because now we are in a fight for the survival of the Russian nation, right? Economically, that is what I am afraid of. Again, I will emphasize, I am not saying that sanctions are good or bad. I'm not saying that I cannot evaluate whether sanctions are effective in changing elite behaviors. What I can tell you is that is what I'm hearing. Very, very quick switch from disbelief to defensive consolidation, right, among ordinary people.
Rita, do you want to jump in?
Yes, so thank you, Regina, and thank you, Jeremy. This is a very comprehensive analysis of what are the potential effects, political repercussions of the sanctions. So I would also emphasize the importance of blame attribution patterns, because if anything negative happens, it does not necessarily mean that according to the pocketbook voting or retrospective economic voting models, I mean, people would immediately attribute the blame to the right agents. So that's not the case, especially in these kinds of dictatorships that like tons of like millions of dollars were poured into the propaganda machine. So of course, the sanctions would affect how much all those media is actually, to what extent these guys are going to be funded. Of course, I mean, they will suffer one of the first ones because this is a luxury for a dictatorship, right? So, and the propaganda machine will be a bit weaker, of course. But again, so I would agree with Jeremy that it's one of my concerns that this anxiety-based or defensive consolidation is a very likely response to that, because those who actually in Russia after the sanctions, they would feel they're left alone. Yes, our government is bad, but no one actually was welcoming us abroad as well. So, and this is a very likely cognitive mechanisms that can be emphasized by the state as well. So this is something to bear in mind.
Andre, would you like to jump in? No?
Me? No, I think there were no specific things that I can respond to.
Do you want to add anything to the discussion?
Yes, so just a tiny point about the effects of sanctions and everything. So even if all the effects realize, and people like in the 1990s, they will start eating only buckwheat or rice. I mean, still we are in a different situation in terms of the relationship between economics and politics. So in the early 1990s, there was no propaganda. There was no propaganda machine effectively built, and there was imperfect democracy in Russia. And now it's just, I mean, propaganda is much stronger than in Nazi Germany because Putin had 22 years to build it. And still, even if people start eating only buckwheat and start just surviving physically, I don't see that everybody will just go to protest against the regime, unfortunately. And again, we will see, and I hope that most people will realize that something is wrong. But it's really a very dangerous situation, I think.
Anybody from the audience want to jump in? I have one more question from the Twitterverse. So on Twitter, we're seeing a lot of discussion of generational divide, very stark, very difficult generational divide. And I wonder what you think about that and the potential for a generational divide. And I have another more difficult question, which is, for the first time yesterday, the Russian military talked about casualties, and we haven't talked about casualties as new information about what is going on, and the soldiers themselves communicating what has been going on, and that as a source of information. So I wonder if you might end our session just by talking about one or both of those. We just have a couple of minutes left. So who wants to start? Rita, can I ask you to start?
Yes, sure. So I'll try to be very quick. On the last point you mentioned, so how the information casualties will affect. So I think it's very clear that the Russian Ministry of Defense was very unwilling to actually make these numbers available. Because, for instance, the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, Комитет солдатских матерей, was extremely on alert, and they were collecting the data on those conscripts who were actually sent to Ukraine, which is actually illegal. And of course, this has an extremely strong galvanizing potential, anti-war potential. And obviously, these numbers are not going to be reliable by any means. So, of course, this information will affect the people's moods inside the country. So maybe I'll stop here.
So sorry, Jeremy, jump in.
Yeah, we shouldn't hope that high casualties will change anything in Russia. And I don't think the generational divide is significant enough also. All of these things will be trumped by what I'm calling defensive consolidation.
Andrea, you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree that the generation divide is not important, since it looks like, at least the turnout to the streets, they were mostly young people, and I think they pretty, especially educated young people, they do realize that their future is stolen or almost destroyed because of everything. So the generation divide is here, but of course within the generations there are also pretty much diverse values and perceptions of what is happening, and there we can see this conflicting dynamics where parts of even in our student groups, there are parts that still think that this is the special operation rather than anything else. On casualties, I think my basic concern is that, and very unnerving one, is that the cost of human life in Russia has been devalued pretty much, and it can be devalued even further. So any number from 1 to, not infinity, but still quite a good number can be tolerated by Russian citizens, unless they're personally related to these numbers, such as mothers again, etc. So I wouldn't expect again here much. Here I wouldn't expect much happening, simply because the value of human life is not that high.
Andre?
Yeah, so just about the generational divide, and again, this is not scientific, of course, because, well, we don't have the data, but I think it is happening, but still there is hope, because it's not in every single family, and my grandmother is completely against the war, and she survived the Second World War. And in the protests in Moscow, and especially in St. Petersburg, we see older people who survived the siege of Leningrad, and they are there. So they are, of course, against bombing of Kharkiv and Kiev. So we'll see. But yeah, it's painful.
Okay. Colleagues, in order to facilitate our teaching, we have to create a little time between sessions. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and just sharing your time at this difficult moment. I know we're all really struggling, and you more than me, but all of us are struggling. But thank you so much for your time.